Education and Palestine. Today we have Hagopian and Tasha Triplett. And Hagopian is a public high school teacher in Seattle, and he's a founding member of Social Equality Educators. And he's also a member of the Interfaith Peace Builders African Heritage Palestine Delegation. And he's also a contributing author to the forthcoming book, Education and Capitalism, Struggles for Learning and Liberation. And we also have our own Tasha Triplett, who is a student here at PSU and a local activist and a student leader for Students United for Palestine and Equal Rights. And so without further ado, I give you Tasha.
Okay. I don't have a clicker for my PowerPoint, so my friend Camille is going to be switching the PowerPoint for me, so I'm going to be doing this, so just ignore it. This is a signal for her. All right, so before we jump into the history of Black liberation in the Middle East, particularly the Black Panthers in Palestine and Israel, I think it's important for you to know kind of where I'm coming from and how I became interested in this, and why I think this story is so important, and how it continues to be overlooked. So, okay, well, I'm going to keep talking while it's working, or you figure it out. So, I went to Palestine in 2008. I went to the West Bank for 6 months to study in the Brissett University's Palestine Arabic Studies program for international students. And my friend Tawfiq Haddad, who worked on Between the Lines, a book about the Second Intifada in Palestine, inspired me to go. And I figured, why not go to Palestine versus going to Europe or someplace to study abroad? I thought that would be a little bit more interesting. So I read a lot about the conflict before I went, but you can never really prepare yourself for your experience in a place like Palestine before you go. And so on my second day in Jerusalem, I was stuck in a snowstorm, and I was staying in like the old city near Citadel Hostel, which is near Jaffa Gate. And I decided to venture outside of my hostel on the slippery cobblestones, and I met an older Palestinian man who recently just moved back to Palestine from living in Texas. And he recognized that I was American right off the bat and invited me to sit down and have some tea with him. And as we were talking, we naturally just started talking about the comparison of the Palestinian incarceration rates and Black incarceration rates in the United States. And we talked for a while, and we finished our tea, and I thanked him. And before we parted, I just reached out and was like, "Thank you for making me feel welcome in this foreign land." And he said, "Sister, you're practically home. You don't even realize it." And that caught me off guard until the next week. I discovered that, they're Black Palestinians. So I, as a history major, I was a little, embarrassed that I didn't know that that much about Black Palestinians, and I particularly am very interested in studying the African diaspora. Thank you. So I was like, whoa, I didn't know there were Black Palestinians. Duh, of course there were Black Palestinians. And it really was the first instance that I began to realize that these levels of human complexities and history that are completely overshadowed by the occupation in Palestine. And so just this picture up here is, of course, connecting the Palestinian apartheid to South African apartheid. And the pictures over here are just kind of demonstrating the cultural history of Blacks in the region, particularly, the three wise men down here, and then up here, this is Judith, who was a rebel Jewish figure in the Bible, who cut a king's head off of and had her Black maidservant help her have the guy's head off. So just some kind of background into Palestine, Blacks in Palestine. Okay, so, most Black Palestinians are concentrated in Jerusalem and Jenin and Jericho. And when I was in Jenin, I was able to visit with a woman who briefly told me her family story. And she told me that, her ancestors came from Nigeria, but many other Black Palestinians' ancestors come from Chad, Sudan, Senegal, and her family were slaves who were freed under the Ottoman Empire, and they converted to Islam in appreciation. And other black Muslims arrived when Palestine was still under British mandate control, and they defected from the British Army to protect Muslim holy sites in the land, which is really interesting. So, today Palestinians suffer a lot of the same things that Arabs suffer under Israeli occupation: traveling, restricted building permits, high incarceration rates, poor health, education. However, they also suffer racism because they have darker skin. And, but in the areas where they are concentrated, like Jenin and Jericho, they're more fully integrated into Palestinian life and, or entire Palestinian life, and they also intermarry with Arabs. So, you might ask, like, why is this important to know? We want to know about Black liberation of Palestine. And like I said, I think it's really important because I became fascinated with, what other pieces, historical pieces of the Black experience that are interwoven in the Palestinian question, like what other pieces of those that are missing and overlooked because the occupation just kind of levels things out and makes it seem like things are so black and white. So I got back to the States and I became really interested in studying the Black Panthers as a part of my history major, and I soon found myself going down a very interesting path. And so, as many people are aware, there's a lot of comparisons between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid. But many United States civil rights groups began making public statements in the 1960s to call for support for Palestinian liberation. For instance, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were really instrumental in doing voter registration during the civil rights era in the Deep South. In 1969, they released a newsletter criticizing the state of Israel and its Zionist policies. And in response of them publishing this newsletter, Roy Wilkins, who is the executive director of the NAACP, called the group anti-Semitic. He said that they were pro-Soviet. And then Whitney M. Young Jr., who was the executive director of the National Urban League, said that blacks have been victims of racism for far too long to revert to the racial hatred against Jews. And Young of the Urban League concluded that SNCC's message was, and I quote, resembled those of the American Nazi Party on Arab-Israeli relations. So this interesting divide is actually endemic of the larger divide in the civil rights, social justice organizations in the United States, which draws a line between the moderates on one side, who are represented by the civil rights movement of the South, the integrationalist policies to really only promoted the social mobility of the black middle class, versus the radical cultural nationalist, Marxist-Leninist, internationalist ideologies of working class and urbanized blacks. And so, essentially this is kind of the NAACP, the Urban League, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on one side supporting Israel, and the Nation of Islam, SNCC, the Black Panther parties, and the Congress of Racial Equality supporting Palestinian liberation. So, I know you can't read this, but this is a picture of the newsletter. You can go online and find it. The purpose of the newsletter in 1967, SNCC's newsletter, was to enlighten readers on the Middle East and the question of Palestine. And this is a quote: We know that white America seldom, if ever, gives a true story about the world events that America's involved in, and they wanted to give another picture, another side of that. So some points in this newsletter is a lot of just talking about, Haganah and different forces and massacres and so on and so forth that associated with the founding of the State of Israel, and also the fact that the U.S. continues to support Israel militarily and financially. And so Stokely Carmichael over here is a famous leader of SNCC. He was a famous leader in the Black Power movement and had ties to the Black Panther Party. He publicly argued that Israeli Jews were exploiting the killing of 6 million of their people by Hitler as a justification for their actions, in stealing Palestinian land. And so he said, this is how he's characterizing this. So he says, in that case, the right course to follow in that circumstance was for Jews then to instead have taken land from Germany, like instead of taking land from Palestine. I just love how matter of fact Stokely Carmichael is. He also called out the Zionist propaganda that persuaded people that anyone who criticized the state of Israel was automatically anti-Semitic. And he declared that if white people who call themselves revolutionaries or radicals wanted black people's support, they had to condemn Zionism as inherently racist. So, Black Panthers of Israel, or Palestine, we're going to get to Israel in a second. Black Panthers of Palestine. Jean Genet, a famous gay French social justice activist, worked with the Black Panthers and the PLO in Jordan in the 1970s. And commenting on the Panthers, or on the Palestinians, he said, to be Palestinian in the 1970s was to question the overall structure and institutional base of society as a whole, to make alliances with all those in the world attempting to resist oppression of all kinds, and to fight from exile for a land that most likely would never be seen. Palestine must exist. On the Panthers, he said that blacks were no longer seen as submissive peoples whose rights had to be defended for them, but determined fighters ready to fight to the death for a movement that was a part of their race all over the world. And so I'm just going to run through some general solidarity points that the Black Panthers had with Palestine liberation. And, as I'm sure some of you are aware, the Panthers' activism really served as a revolutionary example for many oppressed people and indigenous groups and several different foreign nations and countries and so on and so forth. And the Black Panthers, before they became more Marxist-Leninist in this framework, they adopted a lot of ideas from Frantz Fanon, like armed resistance, and they saw that black people in America parallel to other colonized people under traditional colonization. And so that might seem a little wonky, like how can black people in America seem like a colonized group? Where did they get this idea from? Well, just to kind of paint a picture for you. If you think of, all the white people who live in Northeast moving out of Northeast and all the black people who originally moved there moving back and redlining being reconstituted while the majority white police force continues to patrol those streets, that looks a lot like occupation, if you just think of it on the surface that way. So their ideology, eventually evolved to be more of an internationalist framework, and they saw that their struggle was not just international solidarity with all oppressed peoples under white supremacy, but of international resistance against all faces of capitalism, wherever it arose. So in the Panther newspaper in August 1969, they said, "We recognize that our oppression takes different forms, Zionism in Palestine and racism here in America, but the case is the same. It's U.S. imperialism." So the Black Panthers believed that African Americans had a shared history of racial and colonial oppression that Jews and Palestinians faced. Therefore, they had solidarity with both. They couldn't ignore the imbalance of power between the state of Israel and the occupation of Palestine as a result. And so, the Panthers, in a lot of their newspaper articles about the Palestine question, they actually called for an Arab Spring in the 1970s. They called for Arabs to revolt against their oppressed regimes and championed they called for Arabs to revolt against their oppressive regimes that championed Palestinian national sovereignty while denying the sovereignty of their own people. The Panthers said, "The struggle for self-determination is, first of all, a revolutionary struggle against your own oppressive state." And so, they also really chastised Jews on this whole double standard of chosen people. They saw, Israel's assertion of national sovereignty as really exerting national superiority, stating that, nothing more tragic than the arrogance of a chosen people which sets out to achieve its own liberations at the ends of oppressing others. And so, they, along with this, they declared that, Israel would never ever be a secure state because, as long as they continued to break human rights and they acted as agents of U.S. imperialism. They believed that, Arabs and Jews, Palestinians, Israelis, and the Middle East had to work together to resolve the interests of, and because, the conflict wasn't in their interest. The conflict was anti-human, therefore it was not in their interest. And so ultimately the Panthers, they knew that there was only one solution. The survival of Palestinians and Jews, as of all peoples, depends on the revolutionary overthrow of imperialism and capitalism. So on September 5th, 1970, the Black Panthers called a press conference to address the media allegations that the Panthers were anti-Semitic. And I'm just going to read some of the pieces from the Huey Newton's speech that he gave that day, because I think it really kind of puts their framework on the situation and kind of brings it to today, when a lot of people are just like, oh, history repeats itself, or these things keep happening. I think it's very interesting how this story is ignored. So they said, we are not anti-Semitic. As far as the Israeli people are concerned, we are not against Jewish people. We are against the government that will persecute Palestinian people. We have to admit that there is something wrong in the Middle East. The Palestinian people are living in hovels, they don't have land, they've been stripped and murdered, and we cannot support this for any reason. Our view is that people led by the Palestinian people should be led into revolutionary struggle in order to transform the Middle East into truly a people's republic. And at the same time, we support a small group of people who are living in Israel, who are revolutionary and working to see that the Zionist government of Israel be transformed into a people's secular state. They said that, there's a record of Jewish students demonstrating against the Minister of Defense, against the war tactics of Israel, and we encourage this activity. We struggle with a group of Jewish people, so we reject any charges of being anti-Semitic. We realize that some people who have happened to be Jewish and who happen to support Israel will use the Black Panther Party's position that is anti-imperialism and against the ageism of imperialists as an attack of anti-Semitism. We think that this is a backbiting, racist, underhanded tactic, and we will treat it as such. We have respect for all people, and we have respect for the right for all people to exist. So we want Jewish people and Palestinian people to live in harmony together. We support the Palestinians' just struggle for liberation 100%, and we will go on doing this. And we would like for all those progressive people of the world to join our ranks in order to make the world in which all people can live. So now, who are this group that they keep talking about in Israel? Well, that's because there's Black Panthers in Israel. Yes. This is a voting poster for the Communist Socialist Party of Israel, and under it, Black Panthers in bold. In the 1970s, Mizrahi Jews, who are mostly Moroccan descent, made up about 50% of Israel's population. However, they were completely denied access to state institutions because it was dominated by the white European Ashkenazi Jews. So in 1971, Angela Davis went to Jerusalem and helped them set up a chapter. And this actually launched the Mizrahi civil rights movement in Israel. This group was, of course, a group of young people aged 18 to 20. And then, later a lot of community workers and anti-Zionist high school and university students joined them. And, their frustrations rose, like I said, between this inequality that they were seeing every day. They were Jews, but because they had darker skin, they faced racial injustice and economic and political and educational injustice for having darker skin. A lot of their parents had been, convinced by the World Zionist Organization to move to Israel right after the founding of the state, and they weren't necessarily willing to move right away, but after they were promised, equal rights and secure housing and work and education, they decided to immigrate to Israel. However, after arriving there, like I was mentioning before, the code for Jewish pride and being proud of this Jewish-only state meant that you had to assimilate to Ashkenazi, white Jewish, culture, morals, and values, and so on and so forth. And so while the Mizrahi were given full citizenship, they were completely inaccessible to any type of social services or benefits or anything they could get. So they got pushed into, low-wage, low-skilled jobs. And in fact, a lot of their children were placed on trade school tracks versus being put on college tracks. And so it just perpetuated the cycle of poverty and inequality that they were seeing. So that's why, in 1971, after they set up, they said that either the cake will be shared by all, or there will be no cake. They had a lot of similar demands to the Black Panthers, like in the United States, elimination of slums and elimination of juvenile hall. And they were actually the first group to support, openly and officially support the PLO, which at that time was still considered a terrorist organization. So I mean, this is massive for, if you think of 1970s Israel and Palestine. And so they were also one of the first groups to really challenge this like happy, Zionist Jewish melting pot myth that they've kind of established in the state of Israel, that everyone's here and moved together and we all have one culture. So some of their most famous actions were they stole milk from rich middle class Jews, and they delivered it to poorer Jews. And they pretty much said that, that there are cats and dogs in the rich neighborhoods that get plenty of milk day in and day out. So they wanted to reappropriate the milk. Also, one of the most infamous protests in Zion Square against political repression they were facing, they burned an effigy of Golda Meir, and who was the prime minister at the time, and declared that a state in which half of the adult population are kings and the other half are treated as exploited slaves, we will burn it down. So they faced a lot of massive repression, just like a lot of other Black Panther affiliates. And they weren't able to last that long, but they were able to force the Israeli government to start, funding anti-discrimination initiatives in the government. But however, the war in '73 started, and so the government changed their priorities, and all of that money went back into the war effort, and they once again were stuck with higher levels of inequality. And Jesse's going to talk about some of the surviving members, but they still do a lot of Palestinian solidarity work, those who are still alive. So just to wrap up, what can we learn from this? It's more than just global solidarity. It's more than just Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And I think it's also more than, like I was saying, history repeating itself, or it's human nature. And I think, as this picture suggests, what the Black Panthers highlighted time and time again was that the conflict in Palestine and Israel was not about race, it was not about religion. We need to have a clear understanding of the U.S.'s role, the role of U.S. imperialism in the region, and the fact that the Israeli state is a colonial settler state. Those two are bottom line. And so, getting back to this, so what's the solution? The Black Panthers and other Black radical civil rights and social justice groups saw critical links between themselves and the oppressed people of the world. They knew that ultimately one solution there was to resist and dismantle the system that denies humanity and forces us to deny the humanity of others, a system that profits from the exploitation of people, animals, and the planet. And so I just want to end with this quote by Asad Shakur, that it's not our duty to fight for our freedom, it is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other, and we have nothing to lose but our chains.
Wow, that was awesome. I learned a lot myself, and I want to thank Tasha for uncovering that history for us, because they've gone to great lengths to make sure that you don't know anything about that history. Because that history has to be buried, because if you knew that some of the most powerful freedom fighters in world history, some of the movements that we all agree with, here in the United States, ending segregation, fighting against police brutality, if you knew that those movements sided with the Palestinian people, you would question your tax dollars going to build walls around Palestinian people rather than going to schools here or healthcare here. You would begin to stand up and fight against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So you can't know that history. It's very dangerous. And yet, despite their great lengths they go to hide this history, I think people are beginning to discover this in very important ways. And I think just because the first Black president in the United States sides with Israeli war crimes over and over again, he doesn't speak for all Black people today. And I think That was made powerfully clear when Alice Walker, the renowned black author and poet, recently joined the brilliantly named Audacity of Hope flotilla to try to break the siege of Gaza, right, and spoke out against the oppression of Palestinians. And I think it's also important to know that Palestinians know a lot about the black struggle here in the United States. And I went on a delegation to Palestine. It was the Interfaith Peace Builders' historic first African heritage delegation over the summer in July to Palestine, and we found that many of the Palestinian that we met there involved in the popular resistance movements knew the history of the civil rights and black power movement better than many African Americans, unfortunately, here. But it was very inspiring to see that, and I want to tell some of those stories today. But I think, you know, thousands of people around the world are seeing things like the flotilla being shot on and you know, peaceful protesters murdered just trying to bring medical supplies to Gaza, and are beginning to question Israel in a way that we haven't seen before. And there's a new opportunity to revive this history of African American solidarity with the people of Palestine. You know, they shut, when the flotilla was shot on, there was docks all around the world that were shut down by workers in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and this really scared Israel, right? They had a PR crisis, right? And Ehud Barak even said, there are elements, this is a quote to give you a sense of how worried they are about their image right now in Israel. Ehud Barak said, there are elements in the world quite powerful in various countries, including friendly ones, meaning the United States, in trade unions, among academics, consumers, green political parties, and this impetus has culminated in a broad movement called BDS, Boycotts, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is what was done with South Africa. This will not happen overnight. The day after September, when the vote over statehood in the UN happened, people will say, so now October has come, the sky hasn't fallen, nothing has happened, but this is not true. Right? And what he's pointing at is that the legitimacy of Israel's oppression of Palestine is coming increasingly under question, and they have two main strategies for dealing with people who oppose Israel's oppression of Palestinians. The one is to just attack anybody as anti-Semitic who opposes Israel in any way, or anyone who even whispers a criticism of the government. Is smeared as anti-Semitic, gone after by AIPAC, etc. But they have a more clever strategy as well, which is the pink washing, green washing, and now I would say black washing of the Israeli state, right? The pink washing, claiming that Israel is this bastion of LGBT rights, and it's the only place in the Middle East that gives gays rights, so you should support it. The greenwashing, it's the only place that has sustainable energy, and we're, you know, going to help the environment by investing in the oppression of Palestinians. And I would say that blackwashing has become a major component of Israel trying to maintain its legitimacy as a settler colonial state. And by blackwashing, I mean trying to cloak its oppression of Palestinians in the guise of the civil rights movement, of being in solidarity with oppressed African Americans, and trying to bring in African Americans increasingly to support the state of Israel. And I just want to read from a couple of recent statements to show you what I mean about this blackwashing. So there's a recent op-ed from the Global News Service for the Jewish People by David Bernstein on February 9th, and he wrote about what to do when you have a BDS campaign on your college campus. And he said, our goal must be to shore up the support for Israel of the next generation. He wants to make sure that young people see it as a legitimate project. And he said, when I visited one campus last year, I was struck that the Asian and Latino and Black organizations were listed as co-sponsors of the anti-Israel activities on campus. It became clear that no one ever bothered to reach out to them and build friendship. It can start by grabbing a cup of coffee with the leaders representing other student groups and ultimately lead to joint programs. Support for anti-Israel causes then becomes unthinkable, right? There's a clear strategy from being funded by AIPAC and other organizations to get on college campuses and make sure that the student groups of color join with supporting the Israeli occupation. They don't want you at this conference, and I'm sure they probably tried to convince some of you not to be here. And there's a group called the Vanguard Leadership Group that's based in Atlanta, an AIPAC-supported group, and Ira Gluntz wrote an article about this organization, and its leadership goes to historically black colleges and builds solidarity for the Israeli occupation. Its founder and executive director, Gerard Jordan, was present at the 2008 AIPAC Policy Conference, and he claims to have been inspired by a speech of Barack Obama, which led him to create an African-American organization dedicated to the improvement of African-American Jewish relations and increased African-American support for Israel. And the Vanguard Leadership Group has participated in recent AIPAC conferences, and this is what the leader of their group had to say. He said, quote, "Playing the apartheid card, which is calculated to attempt to conjure up images associated with racist South African regimes of the 20th century. The strategy of these activists is transparent as it is base. Beyond that, it is highly objectionable to those who know the truth about Israel's record on human rights and how it so clearly contrasts with South Africa's." So there is a concerted effort in America to try to get young black people to shore up support for the future of Israel. It's in that context that the first African-American delegation to Palestine went this summer. My dad was an anti-apartheid in South Africa activist who worked, he met Mandela in Seattle in the 80s, I guess it was early 90s, and had worked for years and years. I remember growing up going to all those demonstrations. And he went on a delegation with the Interfaith Peace Builders and clearly saw this connection of apartheid in South Africa and what's happening in Israel, and wanted to get African Americans to come and see it for themselves. So some of you have our statement. If you don't have it, there's a couple more here, and you can see what we stand for. Yeah, there's ones around, so look around for people around you. I only have a couple here, but you can get one from me, and it's online as well. It's in that context that we felt it was very important to get African Americans to go and be able to report back to communities of color, especially about the connections really between Palestinians and African Americans that Tasha so brilliantly laid out for us. And it was a group of, and it was an incredible group I got to travel with, amazing group of people. We had young people who are these college students that AIPAC wants to bring into their fold, and we had veterans of the civil rights movement. There's one woman in her 70s, one woman in her late 60s, several men in their late 60s who had all grew up in the South under Jim Crow segregation. To travel to Israel and Palestine with people who grew up under Jim Crow segregation is an eye-opening experience, and you will never question whether Israel is an apartheid state. After doing that, you will likely see that the oppression that the Palestinians went through and go through today is even beyond what these veterans of the civil rights movement said they saw in their struggles in the South. And I want to try to highlight some of the key lessons and experiences that we had on that trip, and then take questions from people. But you know, the lie that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East was made clear before we even got out of the airport, right? This was right around the time of the flotilla, people flying in, declaring they want to go to the West Bank, and so there was heightened security. But the first thing they ask you is, what is your religion, right? There's an early sign of a democracy when you get to the airport. Ask what your religion is, and we knew that there's a clear answer. You're Christian. You have, say that, or you risk deportation, right? So then we get on to the road, and the tour guide shows us the license plates, right? There's Israeli license plates and there's Palestinian license plates in a democracy, obviously, and only Israeli cars are allowed on this street, on this road. They recently changed it so Palestinians legally could be on that road, but if they try to, they're stopped at the checkpoints, their car is completely dismantled looking for bombs, and they no longer have a car. So it's not worth it. That was our way into East Jerusalem. There's so many things I could say, but I'm going to hit on a couple of the key things. One of the most powerful experiences was going to Hebron. Which is, you have a situation where the Israeli settlers, they're not just settling on farmland, stealing farmland from Palestinians. They're going into Palestinian homes where people are living and at gunpoint evicting them and taking their homes. And so we had a day set up to meet with the head of the Jewish settlement in Hebron. And the night before we went to leave to Hebron, we had a big debate in our delegation about whether we should go and meet with this person, because many people felt that it was similar to going to meet with a Ku Klux Klan member, right, who is terrorizing black people in the South with weapons and armed force. And would we go sit down with a KKK member and ask them what they thought of Jim Crow segregation? And so we thought, no, we probably wouldn't do that. But there was overall sentiment that we wanted to be able to report on what they thought and how they presented their argument and be able to expose it. But it was with great trepidation that we went there. And my dad had done this tour once before, and the head of the Israeli settlement there said, yes, I will shoot and kill Palestinians if it means claiming my right to my homeland. And it was, very openly racist. There's videos of him spitting on Palestinian children on YouTube, you can see. And so it was very difficult to go in the presence of these people and listen to what they had to say. Turned out they got a little bit smarter and sent a PR man to meet with us instead of their head guy that my dad had met the time before. And he gave a very quick speech about history hundreds of years ago, about how Jewish people had been here, and so that's why they're coming back to reclaim their rights, and then quickly ushered us out with no question, without being able to ask any questions. Then we got a tour of Hebron from a Palestinian man who's part of one of these popular resistance committees, these nonviolent popular resistance committees. And what we didn't realize is the place we were standing while we were getting that speech from this Jewish settler was right above a Palestinian shop. And so when we went around the bottom, we saw this Palestinian shop. And you look up above, and there's this netting that the Palestinians have put over their shop because the Israelis throw out of their window feces. They throw out acid down on the people. There's garbage all over this net, and so they're trying to drive them out of their house, and these people the Israeli settlers are being protected by the IDF while they're perpetrating just heinous crimes. Like Tasha talked about, I was also surprised about the Afro-Palestinian community, and it was really powerful to meet in the old city of Jerusalem. There's an African quarter, and people, Africans, black Africans who have traveled from Muslim countries to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most holy sites in Islam, stayed and built a community there. And as she said, they faced both an occupation and Israeli oppression, and also racism because of their darker skin. They were very clear to point out the difference between the type of racism that they incurred from Israelis and the type of kind of discrimination that sometimes they faced even from Palestinians. They said, there's prejudice out there amongst Palestinians sometimes about people with darker skin, but the man that gave us the tour talked about how when he first went to marry his wife, who was Arab and Palestinian, their family was hesitant about her marrying a black African and had some racist ideas. But he was able to meet them, talk to them over time, break those ideas down, right, through interaction, because there isn't institutional racism in Palestinian society. There's prejudice, there's sometimes backwards ideas, but what's there of a Palestinian authority isn't rest on the oppression of African people. And so it's a very different experience than they have with the Israeli state that is hyper-racist in all forms that it can. We met with one of the founders of the Israeli Black Panther Party that Tasha talked about, the Mizrahi Jews, and that was a really powerful walking tour, showing us the sites of their struggle and resistance. He said that they originally wanted to name their resistance group the Roaring Lions, but it just didn't have the same ring. And when they named it the Black Panther Party, all of a sudden the Israeli state freaked out, because the Black Panther Party in the United States had a reputation, so they knew they'd picked the right title when they got that response from the Israeli state. And I have some pictures that maybe I can show of some of our walking tour with the Black Panther Party members, and other things from our trip that maybe in the wrap-up I can show a couple of those. I just want to end with one of the most powerful stories from the trip, which was going to the Holy Land Trust outside of Bethlehem in the West Bank. And we met with some of the leaders of the popular committees that are working to form nonviolent resistance to the occupation. And we came in, our whole delegation, there's a picture in that handout that I had out, you can see all of us. And we came into their room and they greeted us, and they were really excited to have us there. And they started off by apologizing to us that there weren't more of their representatives there to meet with us, but they said Israel is going to bulldoze one of the oldest olive trees in the West Bank, hundreds of years old, and many of their activists were out there trying to surround the tree and stop it from being bulldozed. And so throughout this meeting that we had, oftentimes someone would jump up and run out to go replace somebody who had been arrested. Someone would come and tell us about new arrests that were happening, or the bulldozers are getting closer to this tree, that just such a symbol of Palestinian life and their resistance. And the exchange we had in that room was just electrifying between Palestinians resisting one of the most brutal occupations in the world and these heroic people that you've never heard of before who were part of the civil rights movement here in the United States and stood up to Jim Crow segregation. And the Palestinians told us about their long history of nonviolent struggle, right? I believe that occupied people have the right to resist their occupation in any way that they choose to. But I think that oftentimes their long history of nonviolent resistance gets glossed over or not talked about at all as a way to demonize Palestinians. And in fact, they have been resisting nonviolently since even before 48 and have an incredible stories to tell about it. And one of the things, the first Intifada that they told us that they helped, or some of these leaders helped organize, one of their most effective and creative forms of resistance to the Israeli occupation in the first Intifada was refusing to go on to daylight savings time in the West Bank. So what they did is all of the Palestinians wouldn't wind their clock an hour forward or back, one of the ways. So they're an hour off, and so all the shops open at a time that Israel doesn't want them to, and the IDF would walk around and pull over Palestinians to look at their watch, and if it was an hour off, they would smash the watch and often shatter people's wrists as well. So there was a rash of people being sent to the hospital. But it just drove the Israeli government crazy that the leadership of the resistance could get everyone unified doing one form of resisting, right? And one of the women, who is this young Palestinian woman, really emphasized how much women took a leadership role in the first Intifada and had, helped organize women and their children to stand up to the occupation. And there was this woman in our delegation, Gloria, who grew up in Mississippi. And she was the first black teacher to integrate a school in Mississippi. She, when Brown versus Board of Education went through, she said, okay, this means that our kids have a right to go to this school, and we're going to open the school up and make it accessible to the black community. Of course, the superintendent didn't care what the Supreme Court said. There wasn't going to be black kids at this school. So she, over and over again, petitioned, sent letters, got the NAACP to come and threaten a lawsuit, and finally they had to give in and allow her to go integrate this school in Mississippi. And she's telling this story to this young Palestinian woman who's just tears, streaming down her face as she's read so much about the civil rights movement and using those tactics. And here's a woman who participated in it, right? She showed up to school with the court mandate, and the school is surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan on horseback, saying, no, you're not gonna, we don't care what the Supreme Court says either. And she went back to that school every day for 2 weeks. The Klan's there with shotguns, keeping them out. Finally, with the court order, they made the Klan leave, and she actually went to that school and began ushering in black students into that school, facing death threats herself. And the exchange in that room, I think, was really powerful in seeing that we have a lot to learn from each other's struggles. And just to end on this, that I was again really excited to see the exchange of our struggles when 6 courageous Palestinians recently attempted to defy the racist segregation apartheid by boarding Jewish-only buses in Israel. Did people hear about that? Using the freedom ride tactics of the civil rights movement and attempting to board these apartheid buses. And so I think the analogy is a powerful one between the Jim Crow segregation and the apartheid that Palestinians face, that we should make sure we resurrect and use that in our arguments. But one thing that the black delegates that I went on this trip with wanted to stress is that, yes, there's an apartheid situation in Palestine that's horrific, but that's really the easy part in some ways for Palestinians, if you can even say that. That there's also just a direct military control of Palestinian life, and there's just bombings, right, and slaughters from the IDF as well. And so the struggle that the Palestinian people face is hard to even describe, and it's incumbent upon us in the United States to build a new civil rights movement that takes up Palestinian liberation as key to solidarity around the world in winning these movements. Thank you.
Before I open it to questions or comments, I'd just like to make everyone know about this Patrice Lumumba. He was a man arrested. He's from Portland, and he's been in prison for about 10 years, and his sentence is actually for 18. And it's just encouraging everyone to write to him in friendship and support, because he has been in jail for a really long time, and he can get pretty depressed.
And he's the son of Kent Ford, who started the Black Panther Party here in Portland.
Yeah. Right. So just some ground rules before we start the discussion. We are limited on time, so I'm going to limit everyone's comment or question to about 2 minutes. And since I don't know everyone's name in this room, I'm going to call them on an article of clothing. So let's get started.
I think it is extremely powerful to hear Desmond Tutu speak about the way he sees what's going on in, specifically, when he was almost barred from going to Gaza by the Israeli government. I just learned that because I thank you for talking about the long history of nonviolent struggle, Palestinian people. I'm actually going to do a presentation in my sociology of peace class, talk about that, because people just don't know. But I was looking for videos, and I didn't know that they tried to bar him from going to Gaza because they probably are scared that he would go there and know what he was going to see. He actually got in, and he said, you can take and change the names, and it almost looks exactly the same thing, and he said it's actually, as you said, it's actually worse in ways. And so I just wanted to put that out there. Like, people know his history with apartheid in South Africa, so if he's saying it, he's speaking the truth, and he knows intimately the details of what happened, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there for people to research and find out.
And then we had Adam, and then we had the blue shirt.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, first, thank you guys so much. Both, I learned so much from both of those talks. I just want to put out there so everyone knows that on Wednesday, there's actually a series of talks that F.W. de Klerk is giving in Portland. F.W. de Klerk was the last South African president before the end of apartheid, and he, was dragged into ending apartheid, by the movement. But at the very least, he turned a blind eye at the massacre of hundreds of South Africans, and now he's kind of being refashioned as this, big peacemaker, and he's trying, he won a Nobel Peace Prize with Mandela, and so he's trying to use that as, and he's actually speaking at the First Congregational Church on February 29th, same day the Occupy movement here is doing their next huge protest, and so there's going to be a protest outside at 5:30, and I think it's just really it's being organized really quick by some old South African anti-apartheid activists in town. And I think it's really important that the BDS movement here show up in full force and bring the solidarity of the anti-Israeli apartheid movement to connect to that. So people should show up this Wednesday, February 29th at 5:30 outside of the First Congregational Church, which is just down the road here. And again, thank you guys so much. I learned so much. And I just wanted to throw out one question for Jesse in particular. Are there more efforts? Is this the first of many tours? Are there more efforts of bringing the kind of bridging that gap and bringing African Americans to Palestine, civil rights leaders to Palestine? What's been the talk around that?
Again, thank you very much for insightful talk. One question, I've come to America from the UK, and I've always been bewildered by a lot of things that go on here with regards to the Israeli conflict. And this whole issue of AIPAC bringing over African American students or getting them to sign on to their whole agenda is another one that completely baffles me. So I'm just wondering, first of all, what kind of numbers are we talking about? And is this sort of a threat in any sort of way? And what possible arguments could the Israeli Hydaburg machine give to the African American students that would sell in some way what they're going to do? And secondly, for Tasha, again, I found your talk incredibly enlightening. You brought so much that I didn't know about this conflict before. When I first landed in the States last week, I read an interview in Monterey with Robin D.G. Kelly from, I think, University of California. He talked about the Marcus Garvey movement in the 1920s and a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who sent a letter of congratulations to the Israeli president in 1948. I just wanted to see if your research has gone back that further to look at black support for the creation of the State of Israel.
Okay. I'll take a couple of the questions. First on the black delegations. There's another one in October. So I see some black people in the room that should be on that. It's really powerful. I mean, it'll change your life to see people who, first to enter an occupation is just an incredible experience to have your bus boarded by the IDF and your papers checked and your religion and your ethnicity questioned, and the results could be very dire. And then to think that you get to go home and the Palestinians go through that just to go to work every day is an eye-opening experience. And I encourage people to go on this delegation if you can in October. And it's part of an ongoing campaign that my dad is helping to lead in the Interfaith Peace Builders. Trying to build support, and this is, we have our statement here that we're trying to get around to a lot of different prominent black leaders as well to sign on to. It calls for BDS, it calls for ending the occupation, etc. And so we're trying to work in the black community to bring awareness, but also to bring people to see it firsthand for themselves. In terms of how they try to sell this project to young black students, they rely on the fact that they've completely wiped out the history of how Israel was formed in dispossessing a people. So most people don't know much about it, and they just hammer the Holocaust over and over and over again. You're African American, your people survived the Middle Passage, a Holocaust of African people. So, we have a shared experience of oppression. You should support these Israeli people who are just trying to build, a life and a state for people who have been oppressed. And you want, civil rights, and so do we, right? It's an incredible lie, but when you give that incredible lie billions of dollars, you can get it onto college campuses and begin to organize, around that lie. I think they're going to have a big problem in that the flotilla happens, and the state of Israel keeps exposing itself over and over again as being this brutal occupier. And so the lie that they're trying to sell gets exposed, and then we organize conferences like this, and they got another problem. Right? And so, I'm not sure how successful they'll be, but, Jesse Jackson Jr., for instance, Jesse Jackson, at least in his campaign, supported Arafat when he was running for president. Now his son, who was a congressman here, just went on the AIPAC-led tour of Israel over the summer supporting it. So they're making inroads with prominent black politicians and trying to get black church leaders on board as well. And we're trying to push back against that. So it's a struggle, and we'll have to see, where it goes.
And just to throw out real quickly, I agree. It's the millions of dollars that's being poured into historical black colleges right now to set up these programs. I mean, that's how they're like, oh, free trip to Israel. That's kind of how they get everyone in that one. Like, let's go to the beach. It's awesome, sunny. But as far as black support under Marcus Garvey, I've heard of that before. That's not my particular area of expertise. I'm more on like researching the Black Panthers. But I have heard that before, and I'm not going to definitively give like a yes, this is the correct answer. But from what I know, like African American history is my focus in my history major. But Marcus Garvey was a separatist, not so simple terms, but essentially the separatist movement. And they wanted to establish a colony in Africa to return blacks to Africa. And they actually did a lot of work, some work, not a lot of it, with the KKK and trying to scare blacks into moving to the colony in Africa. So that's very similar to what the state of Israel did with Mossad, as far as getting Iraqi Jews and Mizrahi Jews to move to Israel. So I see that's probably where a connection comes from. But like I said, I can't give any definitive answer because Marcus Garvey is a little bit further.
And the girl, the yellow, and then.
I'm Sister Elaine Kelly, and I'm with Friends of Seville North America. And one of the things that we are doing is trying to develop our relationship with black theologians around the world in order to develop that theology about apartheid. And recently we had a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, and we've been working with someone who's in the Carter Center. His name is Sam Jones, and we have developed a scholarship fund to fund black religious leaders who want to go on a Seville witness visit or an international conference. So that's another part of the movement, is trying to educate Christians in this country by developing relationships with the Palestinian Christian community in Jerusalem, where we support the Seville Liberation Theology Center. So that's another resource.
Is Bishop Tutu anything in your organization?
Archbishop Tutu is called the international patron of Seville. He has spoken at a couple of our conferences, and he does other things with us also.
I just wanted to speak to the Vanguard leadership group. I think the only big thing they've done since they came out was put a full-page ad in student newspapers, and it's basically like a letter kind of describing their arguments. And I think one of the big threats about this group is not so much in terms of making inroads with the black community, but just to be like a white student, you're liberal leaning, you read this, you open up your student newspaper, there's this letter by black student leaders saying you should support Israel. You already have a little bit of white guilt over the civil rights situation here, so you're just going to completely accept that without questioning it. It's just another, it's like this, big solidarity.
This question is more for Tasha, but I'm curious about what either of you have to say about it. But I just learning so much from your talk and knowing your investment in history and seeing that a lot of this is like part of historical erasure and like kind of a propaganda machine to hide these histories. Just wanted to hear some more of your thoughts on how to counteract that kind of aggressive erasure that happens around radical history.
And we had the person in blue and the black.
I got a comment and a question. I think it's really crucial having this discussion and highlighting, although the exact circumstances aren't perfectly the same, but the connections between the history of Jim Crow segregation in the U.S., apartheid South Africa, and the conditions in Palestine is, I think, is really crucial because for the left, for the progressive movement, opposing racism and all these different forms has to be a part of everything that we do. You know, it may seem like it's not connected, but racism and all these situations is one of, if not the most important thing that has kept the masses divided and has allowed, you know, levels of inequality that are just disgusting in this world. So I think it's crucial to make these connections. And obviously, if we can weaken Israel, because it's a key linchpin to U.S. power, it will weaken U.S. imperialism. And I think that's a good thing because it will create more space for the peoples in the Middle East to be able to rise up. And also, you know, from a standpoint of those of us in the U.S., we know damn well there's some good uses for the military spending that's going to Israel and to war around the world, to stop schools from being closed, to stop the attacks on budget cuts. So I think, you know, the left has to be able to make these connections. And then comment/question. I can't remember if I heard this from Jesse before, or it might have been when I heard Omar Barghouti speak over the summer, but one of the most disgusting attempts at like a combination of greenwashing and blackwashing was, you know, this, I don't know if it was like a tree farm or like national parks are trying to develop in Israel, but they tried to get Coretta Scott King to like name a farm or a forest or something like that, you know, after her, as a way to basically give cover to what so if, you know, Martin Luther King's wife is endorsing, you know, what's going on in Israel, then, well, shit, it shouldn't, you know, it can't be that bad, right? I think that's the story, but I was hoping maybe you could clarify and if there's more background to it, because I think that's just, it's just straight up lies, like hoping that she doesn't know what's going on. And I know there was a campaign to try to get her to withdraw. I can't remember if she did or not, but I think it's really telling of that's the deception that will go to.
I think the person in the back end red sweater.
I think I heard correctly earlier, Tasha, you were saying there was like 50% population
In the 70s.
in the 70s of Moroccan.
Yes.
How do they relate to the Sephardic Jews?
Person in the black sweater over there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to comment on sort of like ways to combat the erasure and sort of rewriting of history for ideological means. I think, you know, one of the most important resources that we have as students and teachers on campuses is independent publishers like Haymarket Books, and not to plug them that much, but you know, we've got you know, Black Liberation and socialism, and it's really helpful in connecting all of these struggles and sort of like understanding what this history actually means in the face of all this money that's been devoted towards just completely whitewashing the whole history that's involved. And so in addition to that, you know, just being able to have that resource to learn the history, and then, you know, a part of that, the next step in trying to combat the erasure of that kind of history is, you know, taking the knowledge that you can gain for yourself and taking it to campuses and movements and just getting involved in that.
I'm interested in how successful the Black Panthers were in achieving their goals since their creation in 1971. And the second part of my question is, what actions did the Israeli government take to undermine the Black Panthers, and how successful were they?
Yeah, I just want to jump on a little bit to what you said in the back about kind of this being able to challenge imperialism, because I don't think it's just a matter of bringing resources home. I actually think fundamental to challenging imperialism in the Middle East and around the world is actually challenging racism, which is at the heart of imperialism, because to justify the continued occupations, the wars, the devaluing of life of the Arab and Muslim populations, the people of North Africa, at the heart of that takes an actual racist project. And it actually, the funding that's used, not only for the military hardware and that's used there, but also the laws that are being passed have a dual purpose. One is obviously, to oppress the people of the Middle East. The other is to oppress the Arab and Muslim community here. But very quickly, for instance, the Homeland Security budget is leaking into patrolling and actually arresting and deporting Latino immigrants here in this country, and the racism that's contained with that, as well as militarizing the police forces, which have always had a history of brutality against the black population in this country. So I think it's actually connected in a much more integrated way as well to the fight of racism ideologically and the material resources that are used here to oppress minorities in this country as well.
So we've had a lot of great questions and comments, so I'm just going to bring it back to Lyle and Jesse for a little bit. Oh, sorry, Tasha and Jesse. Sorry.
I'm going to stop backwards. As far as the Israeli Black Panthers, they faced massive repression. They were arrested. There weren't that many to begin with. There were probably, like, I would say at its height, like maybe 30 core organizers. It was a very smaller group. And I think that's just the dynamics of race and discrimination within Israel. But the fact that they sided with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, like I was saying at the time when it was like, ooh, it's terrorists, they're blowing things up, they're hijacking planes, it really isolated their base in Israel. And like I said, right after the war in '73 started, it was just nothing. It's like, I mean, kind of here after 9/11, the global justice movement was great, and then 9/11 happened, and, it's nothing. So it's kind of that same, like, repressive sort of like, Also, I mean, the Israeli government was just completely, they called them animals. Golda Meir, for instance, said that they brought the discrimination with them because they were discriminated in their previous countries, and so they just brought that mindset with them that they were always being discriminated against. I mean, just the way they spun the story in the media was just crazy. And like, if you just Google Israeli Black Panthers, a lot of the news coverage, like there's a site that just has like the news that of covering the story and how that was brought out, which is interesting. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi is like Northern African Jews, and Sephardic are like Arabs. So that's kind of the separation. And like people get confused because you think Moroccan, it's in they're Arab, considered Arab because in North Africa, but
Do they have like good relations with each other?
Yes, they do actually, and in fact, I didn't really talk about that specifically, but the Israeli Black Panthers consider themselves Orientals to include all brown Jews into their group. So they one of their demands was to push for more Oriental representation in the institutions inside of the state of Israel. And the erasure of history. There's so many different points. I mean, that's kind of one of my passions. But I think being creative is really a major one. And what I mean by being creative is keeping history public. I feel like, in institutions like this, I mean, I'm going to graduate from here as a history major. And, I love people in the history department, but I feel like oftentimes history is kind of this, like, ivory tower thing, and everyone else either has to eat up what's been given to them, and people aren't really empowered to invest in it for themselves. And so that's why I want to be a high school teacher, because I want to teach my students that you have agency, just like everyone throughout history has had agency, because things would have never changed or happened without human agency. Like, this glass isn't here just because I imagined it, and magically created out of, like, someone made this, and, like, transported it here, and I got the juice and put it, and someone made the juice, like, so, I mean, that's just an example of, like, putting people back into history. I feel too oftentimes it's like, oh, this is something that happened in the distant past, and, so on and so forth. And I mean, I know you worked on the Gay Genius, comic book. I mean, I think that is, like, a great way, to get a graphic novel out there that has history of people that are completely ignored, but in a fun, creative way that just people eat it up and they can take something with it and they can own it. So I that's my personal answer. I literally can talk about that for hours. Like, that's my passion in life.
You should come teach at Garfield with me. We'll have fun. Just a couple quick points. Can you put the last slide on there? Because the question about Coretta Scott King, it's a perfect example of the erasure of history. And I learned this story from Omar Barghouti while I was in East Jerusalem.
This one?
Oh no, I'm sorry, not that one. There's one with Omar. Yeah, there we go. Me, yeah, that one. So this is in East Jerusalem, and he's doing a book reading for his BDS book, and it was the first time he did this in Palestine, in Israel. But at this point, it's an illegal book reading, right? Because you can't advocate for BDS in Israel. People know that law passed in the only democracy in the Middle East. You can't say that you don't want to spend your money somewhere. Or you can be held liable for any losses they claim that they got from that speech, right? So here we are at an illegal book reading. That's my dad and me with Omar. Hearing him advocate for divesting from Israel. And we asked him about this blackwashing thing, and he was the one that told us that Coretta Scott, there's a forest in Israel named the Coretta Scott King Forest that's built on a Palestinian village that was demolished and the people driven out who are now refugees, right? That is classic of how Israel works, right? They cloak their oppression in the language of civil rights. And so that's part of what our delegation wants to do is we have people working to get in touch with Coretta Scott King. Did you know, we don't have any idea how this happened. Did you know that there's this forest named after you? Did you know that the people who used to live there had their homes just demolished to have it there so they could have their nice green, environmentally friendly Israel? And then just the last thing I say is it's also important that right here in the United States that African Americans and everybody in the Occupy movement and all social justice activists begin to build links with all Arab and Muslim people, because the same repressive police apparatus that is labeling people terrorists, this Islamophobic state of the United States that's labeling people terrorists, is the same ones locking up black and brown people at unprecedented rates. 1 in 7 Americans is under correctional facility control, right? And this is, our oppressions are intimately linked. It's not just a question of wanting to build abstract solidarity with people in the Middle East, but it's a question of my own liberation is bound up in the liberation of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims, and that's the type of social justice movement that I want to build here in the U.S.
One last round of hands, starting with the person in the back with like the green shirt. Yeah, you.
Yes, my question was, when you were talking about the Black Panthers from Morocco or in Israel, and they wanted equal treatment and end the discriminations, did they want that for everyone under Israeli rule or only for the Jews under Israeli rule?
So I have an open stack, so feel free to ask or comment.
I was just curious to hear more. I'm sorry, is the speaker's name Tasha?
Oh, yeah.
Tasha. Sorry. I just was curious if you could talk about the program that you were part of as your studies, that you went there to do, what that was like sitting in within an institution.
This is more of a comment, but I think it's important for those of us that are U.S. citizens with a shiny blue passport to realize that when we travel to Israel, if we go through Tel Aviv, it's different if you are a U.S. citizen who also has dual Palestinian Jordanian citizenship. You generally, I'm not saying always, cannot go through Tel Aviv. You have to go through Amman, and you have to travel on your Palestinian ID and not your U.S. citizenship, your U.S. passport. And so therefore, when you enter, you go in a different direction, you're processed differently, you ride a different bus. So it's very different going in as a tourist, depending on your single citizenship status or your dual citizenship.
Just one other comment related to the treatment of Mizrahi Jews and others there. And going back to the whole APAC Vanguard group, of course there are a lot of demonstrations happening right now in Israel from the Mizrahi Jews and one people who support talking about the discrimination that's going on. And I just wonder if there's any work then to try to use that then to counter this whole Vanguard APAC kind of movement.
Yeah, so just in terms of the fact that we face a lot of institutionalized racism here still in the United States, one struggle that all Americans could work towards is the end of oppression in Palestine. I was wondering if either of you had any advice for Americans who also maybe, instead of finding that point where we come together, instead of finding that outside of the United States, other things we can do within the United States to work with our brothers and sisters who are all Americans, Black, white, Latina, in the United States to build that solidarity together just before we even move outside of our national boundaries.
Yeah, you.
Oh,
Andrew.
thanks. Yeah, I'm just kind of really impressed and amazed by the resistance of people in Palestine at the moment, and also the people who were in the 60s fighting against the racism and they were going on the freedom marches. I remember when I was kind of really young, seeing the TV news footage of people fighting, going out marching, being hosed down, having dogs set against them, and all that kind of thing. And you're seeing this again in Palestine, when people are going out demanding their rights and that, and they really just kind of keep on. It's just kind of amazing seeing reading people like Stokely Carmichael and that, and they just kept on. I think there's kind of a lot of courage there. But I think it's a case of really, we still haven't achieved equality in this country, and we've got to fight against apartheid. And that means getting involved in all kinds of different things. And I think a great way is with the BDS campaign here that's going on. And I think there is the campaign against the New Seasons and then stocking goods from Israel. And so I think there's a lot of things we can get involved in our own small way. And that doesn't really take up considering what people have done in the past and have gone through. I think the least we can do now is kind of carry on and fight for a just and equal society.
I guess just real quick, I just wanted to speak to the kind of point on the erasure of history, because this is so crucial in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. I mean, I think, just as growing up, learning about this through Hebrew school, I mean, it's a totally different, skewed, ridiculous history that has nothing to do with these actual facts, that most Jews learn in this. And I think it's great that we've got like some high school teachers here, and I teach at Jefferson, and I know there's a lot of teachers in the Northwest in particular that have anti-apartheid views, both when it comes to they're teachers who wrote curriculum around South African apartheid, and there's teachers now who are beginning to write more and more curriculum around Israel-Palestine. And I think, it's interesting, one of the first books, Bill Bigelow from Rethinking Schools, which is this social justice curriculum group, put out, it was called Strangers in Their Own Country, around South African apartheid. And no publisher would take it at the time, because it was published in the height of apartheid South Africa. And he had to kind of restart, part of why Rethinking Schools got started was to publish that. So we started their own publisher, book publisher, and I think that right now what we really need is some serious curriculum around Israel, Palestine. And I think some getting together teachers in the Pacific Northwest to take on a project like that, I think would go a long way towards kind of fighting that erasure of history. And just to end, I would say that our ability to do that kind of curriculum in the classroom and engage our students in that fight absolutely depends on the strength of the movement. Teaching economics is a totally different ballgame now that Occupy Wall Street has spread through the entire country, right? So I just want to encourage people to join the BDS movement, join Super here on campus, and we can bring you into our classrooms and combat the erasure of that history.
Awesome. So we're almost out of time. So I'm going to bring it back to our speakers to answer your questions. They're going to still be here, so you can still ask some questions after this. So I'll give it back to Tasha and Jesse.
So as far as the Israeli Black Panthers and whether or not they were claiming liberation for themselves or liberation for all, at the beginning when they formed in 71, they were very much on the same line as the Black Panther Party in the United States. Like I said, this wasn't like the Black Panther in the United States where they had 55 national chapters. This was this one little chapter with 30 people max in Jerusalem in the heart of Zionist Israel. So as they faced a lot of repression and their members were getting put in prison, so on and so forth, it just kind of fell apart. It fell apart. There wasn't a lot of room for women to move into the organization, which was, we can talk about this for hours, but Black Panthers had their own issues with here until 1973. But, it's like it just kind of crumbled in on itself from this massive repression. And another interesting, I just thought, when I was doing some research, I found this, and I can show people my references. But there's this really interesting news article that I came across in the Jerusalem Post that was like, ooh, the anniversary of the Israeli Black Panthers. This is great. There's a street named after them now. And then the article repeatedly kept saying they weren't about tearing down the state of Israel. They just felt discrimination and they just wanted equal rights. And it kept saying it over and over again. It's like, when someone threatens to burn down a state while they're burning the effigy of the prime minister, I think it's a little bit more than they were just angry at being discriminated against. So I just this whole going back to this erasure of history and rewriting what people actually did and said and how important that was. We can talk more about Brzett offline, but I highly recommend that everyone signs up for Brzett's program. It's the Palestine Arabic Studies program. They have it 3 times a year. You do not have to be a university student. Anyone can go. They have Arabic and cultural and history. The best history class I ever took was a history of the occupation when I was there with Said Namir. And I just thought I thought the program was great. It's not that expensive. When I was there, it was 2008. It was it was $1,800 for 3 classes, including books. And you can't really beat that. I think we had a friend who wanted to go to Tunisia, and it was $16,000 a term or something like that. So I highly recommend it. We can talk more about that, but they have a website. I just check it out if you're interested in going to Palestine. That's a great program to go through, and they have summer camps as well if you don't want to go for a 6-month period. And also another interesting thing. I'm glad that you brought up people traveling into Palestine who are Palestinian descent and having to deal with that, because oftentimes, particularly when I was coming from the north of the West Bank back to Ramallah, which was near where I was living at, I often got stopped at checkpoints because they're like, oh, you're coming from Jenin. Are you black? Are you black Palestinian? Are you Palestinian? I'm like, well, there's a big eagle on my freaking passport. No, but I'm flattered that you were trying to send me through another path because you're just looking at the color of my skin versus who I'm with. So I got really aggressive when only when I was holding my passport though. And I think, I'm glad Hannah brought the question up as far as what we can do here, and I definitely think the BDS movement, as far as, supporting Palestinians' right to resist the Palestinian liberation is great. But, I'm going to go back to what Jesse was saying, 1 in 7 people are incarcerated in this country. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and we're one of only 5 countries that still kill people, who are incarcerated. And there's a new documentary out that's called The House I Live In that's about the war on drugs. And in that documentary, during the research, they discovered that there are more black men incarcerated in prison now than there were 10 years before the Civil War. In slavery. So when we have that massive of a problem that's going on, and it's cycling back into these cycles of poverty, cycle of oppression, and so on and so forth, and people can't get out, they can't vote, they can't get food stamps, they can't get unemployment, they can't get jobs, and that's just, it's bringing all of us down. And I think that's one thing that people really need to wake up, that this isn't like, we haven't achieved racial, awesomeness in America yet, but I think that's because oftentimes, it's kind of like this erasure of history. We like to pay attention to these band-aids, building of the Martin Luther King Monument, which was made in China, in DC, for instance, which a misquote is on the side of the statue that will be there forever, a misquote, until we take it down. But I mean, it's just things like that. It's like people just think Martin Luther King talked about, I have a dream, and that's it. They don't want to talk about he's out, supporting poor people's rights, and he's out supporting workers' rights, and he's talking about, the U.S. is the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. So I just think, that's why I love history, but I definitely recognize that there's like these pulls of like whose line gets told and whose line is more important than someone else's line. And so yeah, we're gonna do a study group on the new Jim Crow, which is by Michelle Alexander. So you should come talk to me if you're interested in doing that next term. I think we're gonna start in April.
I'll just hit a couple quick questions, and then I just want to end with a story from my trip. In terms of building solidarity amongst oppressed people here in the U.S., it's of critical importance. Segregation in the United States didn't end when Jim Crow laws fell, right? Today, the schools in the United States are more segregated than they were in 1968. Right, so we have our own, apartheid struggle to fight against here in the United States, as people have brought up really well. But I think we can't see them as two separate things, like dealing with our problems and then building solidarity internationally as well after we've built solidarity here, because the Occupy movement has put it very well. It's the 99% against the 1%, and that's true globally, right? And they control and dominate us by dividing us. As long as we're divided by nationality, by race, by gender, by sexuality, in any way they can, then we're pitted against each other, fighting for scraps, while the 1% continues to take our money and give it to bankers and use it to blow up people around the world in these wars. And so we have to see the international struggle is a critical importance to building this any movement for social justice. On the Mizrahi Jews, you saw these tent movements in Israel started right when we were there with the African delegation. People demanding better living facilities and services from the government. But unfortunately, that legacy of the Israeli Black Panther Party, of the Mizrahi Jews who stood in solidarity with Palestinians in the 70s, has been completely severed. And so actually, the Mizrahi Jews ideologically today, both through repression of this Israeli state and then also buying off sections of them, Mizrahi Jews, by the Palestinian guide that we had showing us these tent camps, said, these are some of the most ardent Zionists. They want more money for, their community, but part of that could be we could take a Palestinian home and give that to us, and then, that's helping meet our needs as Jewish citizens. So there's a long way to go with the Mizrahi Jew question today. I just want to say that the question of erasing history has come up over and over again, and the brother who pointed out reading books is really critical, and I'd say everyone's got to read BDS, because this campaign helped to bring down apartheid in South Africa, and it's going to do the same thing if we get active behind this movement in Israel. Black liberation and socialism is critical to understanding the history of African American struggle. And I picked this up while we were in meeting in the West Bank about popular resistance in Palestine, a history of hope and empowerment that goes through the decades and decades of nonviolent popular committees and struggles in Palestine. And we met with activists in Bethlehem, and it was an incredible experience. We did a homestay, our black delegation there in Bethlehem, in the West Bank, and this is a community that has had some of the most incredible creative approaches to resisting the apartheid wall that has cut them off. So the first thing we did was go out to the field where their olive trees were and look at all the spent rounds all over the ground and see the casings and the tear gas shells and everything. And he said the wall used to be right here. It's not here anymore, and it's the first victory against the wall that Palestinians had. And he explained what they did, and it's an amazing story. They, for years and years, had protests against the wall every Friday in this small town. International Solidarity people came, and everyone in this small town would go out and demonstrate against the wall. They did all kinds of amazing things. They built a box with bars and locked themselves into it and put it in front of where the wall was going to be built, so that the wall, they had to deal with this prison that they created for themselves before they could continue the wall. They had pictures of themselves they showed us where they painted everyone in the town blue to look like Avatar and go out and protest, because that image actually went around the world and raised questions, what's going on in this little town? These are some highly creative people who have resisted in all kinds of ways, but the way they scored the first victory against the wall was, you look over the wall and you see this massive Jewish settlement, and it's completely illegal. And what I learned there is that it's not illegal under UN law or international law. It's illegal under Israeli law to have a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. So there it is, illegal by everybody's law, but it's growing and growing year after year. And as soon as one or two houses form, then the IDF says, well, we have to come and protect these people, legal or not. So they thought, well, let's try this. We want to build our own settlement here on our land. So they found a hole in the wall way down, and they took a trailer and drove it up right next to the Jewish settlement and parked it and said, here's our settlement, right? We challenge you to move this. This one's legal. These ones are illegal under your own law. What are you going to do? And the head IDF guy comes up and he says, well, yours is obviously illegal because it's a mobile unit. And mobile units are illegal. They're not considered true homes. And so this is going to have to be gone by 8 a.m. tomorrow. So they said, well, what would be considered a permanent home? And they said, well, it's got to have a foundation and it's got to be so and so big. And they said, okay. They went back, they got on the phone, and they said, we have till 8 a.m. to get the resources to build a permanent home here. So they snuck in concrete in the dead of night with all sort of cloak and dagger clandestine hidden on the bottom of their vans. And they built this small little shack, which there's a picture of there. They built this small little shack with an actual concrete foundation that he took us to while he's telling us. And there, the head IDF guy comes back at 8 a.m. in the morning and sees this house has been built overnight, and he just freaks out. He's frothing at the mouth. How did you let them build this house here? This is horrible. This could be international disaster for us if we bulldoze this home right next to the Jewish settlement. So they actually had to move the wall back behind where this home is and give the Palestinians all of their olive grove that they had there, right? And these are people who, have studied the civil rights movement and use it as a basis, but are developing their own incredible tactics of resistance, and that's a story that's going to inspire me to fight back here in the U.S.